Hi, everyone. Welcome to week one of the American Community College. We are starting our discussion of two-year institutions in post-secondary education in the United States by taking a brief look at the history and evolution of those two-year institutions in our country. So we're going to start with a timeline, and I think that in order to talk about the history and evolution of community colleges, we need to briefly touch on the history of American higher education. Hopefully, you've gotten this through other courses with us in the program, so I hope this is mostly review material. So, in American higher ed, everything started in 1636 with the establishment of what is now Harvard University in Cambridge, Massachusetts. This was a private institution, and private institutions were the only game for higher education in this country. Obviously, before we were even a country, but that remains the education du jour for quite some time. And the next point that we have on the timeline that you see represented with the water fountain at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, 1789, is the founding of our first public institutions in what had been the original 13 colonies and now the earliest states after the forming of our union. It's significant that there were a small number of institutions. There had been quite a proliferation of private institutions, particularly in the northeastern corridor and in a few other portions, such as little further into the interior of Pennsylvania and Ohio, but largely higher ed looked very different in those times. But higher ed in the 17th and 18th century was really the purview of um, the real, what we would describe as extreme upper class, the social and financial elite of this country. But with the advent of public education in the South, and I think it's interesting that all of the first uh, public institutions that survive today were all in southern states. We have the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, University of Tennessee at Knoxville, the University of Georgia in Athens, and the University of South Carolina, all established between right around 1790 to 1800, basically. So in that is about a 13-year period, we saw the establishment of what became four major universities in the Southeast, and they all survive today. Some other points to note that I think contributed to what became the community college approach. In 1828, we had the Yale Report, and as you'll remember from Foundations of Higher Education, the Yale Report, what's significant from that is a movement away from what had been the classical curriculum toward and really opened the doors to a broader range of study and the elective principle. Around 1850, we saw the influence of uh, the Germanic mode of higher education, which had its focus on research and scholarly production. And so we had some of the first doctoral programs awarding PhDs being founded after 1850 in this country. 1860, of course, we're looking at the events that led to the Civil War, and obviously that had profound effects on higher education, not only at that time because basically every institution, particularly in the South, closed, but then the effects of Reconstruction and what that meant for re-strengthening higher education in this country. 1862, which I see is not on I don't have a dot on the timeline, was the first Morrill Act, which was our first land grant act. Then we had the second land grant act, followed up with the second Morrill Act in 1892. Um, Without those, we may not have the model of community colleges that we have today, where the focus is on access and educational opportunity. Um, Not only do land grant institutions owe everything that they are today to those two acts and the opportunities that they were afforded by the intent to provide educational opportunity to educate the masses. But like I said, the community colleges probably would not look today the way that they do without the land grant acts. Then we have 1901, which is the establishment of the first junior college in this country, Joliet College, which is located in Joliet, Illinois, southwest of Chicago. Joliet was the brainchild, as you see here quoted. I actually wasn't even looking at the screen when I saw that. I thought I was being cute and novel, but it was the brainchild of Stanley Brown and William Rainey Harper. And the whole idea was to free up the faculty at the University of Chicago to focus on advanced study and scholarship with juniors and seniors. That the notion of providing that introductory course of instruction associated with the first and second years of undergraduate life were not what Harper wanted his faculty to be doing. And so he worked with J. Stanley Brown to create Joliet College. And what's interesting is that Joliet has always been a public institution where the University of Chicago is a private institution. I've just always been interested by that little fact. The whole purpose of Joliet obviously was transfer, and so that became the focus of our initial community colleges. They continued to grow beyond 1901 and continued to move on from there. I've got 1910 on there, but it should say the 19 teens to the 20s, we saw a good bit of growth in community colleges in this country. And what's interesting to me is that it was at this time um, that we saw a lot of changes in higher ed in general. There's a lot of focus being placed on experiential learning, and this was also applied in community colleges. And so we started to see some of the first, what we describe today as vocational training programs in two-year institutions. Some of these were actually here in the South in Mississippi and Texas, which are two of the earliest statewide systems of community colleges in this country. Some other big dates to note that have had direct effects on community colleges in this country. 1944, we had the passage of the Servicemen's Readjustment Act, otherwise known as the GI Bill. Um, this provided even more increased access and opportunity, and just the sheer numbers of servicemen and women who were returning from World War II and seeking educational opportunity to take advantage of those GI Bill benefits was tremendous. And not everyone wanted that 4-year experience, uh, partly because they'd been in battle, and in large part, 4-year institutions were very much residential in loco parentis places of learning. And imagine you've been out on the battlefield facing some pretty grisly experiences, and you come back and there's a curfew in the dormitory. So that definitely helped spur the growth of a number of community colleges across the country, and in fact led to the creation of some community colleges. Another important date that I think has some effect on community colleges, 1954, with the State versus the Board of Education in Topeka, Kansas, Brown versus Board, rather. The famous desegregation case. It was really about K-12 education, but and so there really aren't a lot of direct connections to higher ed when we talk about desegregation. It certainly got things started the conversation. Yeah, I think it definitely provided some fuel for the fire that was very needed to address integration efforts at a number of institutions in this country. But one thing that we'll see later in this term is a number of community colleges at this time were part of the state's or even their local board of education. They were not part of a higher education board or system. They fell under the purview of K-12 education. And so any court mandated or legislative mandates uh, uh, aimed at addressing integration and desegregation efforts that were really addressed to an entire Board of Education and the schools which it governed would have applied to those two-year institutions as well. So I definitely think that this is the one part of higher ed where we see a direct impact of Brown, even though it was very slow and deliberate. And I think there can certainly be arguments made that we're still seeing some of those desegregation efforts in some school districts and institutions. Maybe not desegregation, but definitely full integration. Another big point of American history that's had a big impact on the community college sector was the space race in the 50s and 60s between the United States and Soviet Union. There's a lot of push, a big push to try to beat the Russians in space and technological advances that resulted in tremendous funding increases for educational programs for all sectors of education. And this was especially true for community colleges where new programs uh, were being developed that were aimed at providing hands-on training in these emerging technologies. Um, and so we can definitely thank the space race for some of the proliferation that we saw of community colleges in the 50s and 60s. Um, Also, there's not, I don't think there's any coincidence when we look at the timeline of when we saw some big booms in enrollment in community colleges in the mid 60s, um, which I don't really have on the timeline. Um, the baby boom, the baby boomers who were really, that first wave of baby boomers born in 45 and 46, they were looking for places to pursue education after high school. And so we saw higher education grow tremendously in all sectors, but community colleges were a big part of that growth as well. 1964, we had the passage of the Civil Rights Act, which really helped open the doors even more for access across higher education, reinforced the message of the open access that would be available at community colleges. So that certainly helped drive some enrollment. And so we saw big increases in enrollments in community colleges by African Americans in the 1970s. And we saw another resurgence in the 80s as well, overall, not just by African Americans, but overall. And then in the 1990s and early 2000s, our big increases have been in Latino and Latina populations of community college goers. Um, this is it's been projected that Latinos are going to be the largest subpopulation in any institution of higher learning in coming years. Whether or not that will be true, we'll see. Um, but certainly the effect of it has been profound in terms of enrollment. And then beyond, who knows? That's maybe that's part of the discussion that we'll have this semester as we talk about community colleges and think about the role that they play. One thing that we're going to look at later in the term are the varying roles that community colleges play. That transfer function is just one part of the charge of community colleges. And so, just to wrap things up, I like these images because I think they show some interesting diversity perspectives of what community colleges look like. In the upper left picture, we see a very traditional campus feel. That is a community college. On the right-hand side, you may recognize that building if you've seen the movie Good Will Hunting. That is Bunker Hill Community College, which was depicted in that film. And the lower picture is actually a rendition, an artist rendition of a community college facility that is in the works. I forget where this might be in Florida. I don't remember where I pulled that picture from. Um, but I think that's part of the discussion we'll have is that there's no one set perspective of what a community college is, and what we're going to be discussing in, I believe, next week, either next week or the week after. Uh, we're going to be talking about the students who attend community colleges and just how diverse they are.